This is the entrance of the tower. A strange dungeon whose layout changes every time you go in. This is the training dungeon, where you earn few experience points for defeating enemies, but can easily learn new skills. If you find the enemies in other ruins to be too strong for you, you should come here and polish your skills. Moreover, you can also get something good if you make it to the top. You are now able to go up to level 10 in the dungeon. So, you want to come in? Well then, be careful.
Federico was kind enough to mostly tell us what this dungeon was about. While we climb our way to the great loot at the top, we're going to show off Chain's other Psyframe parts, the axe parts, which we needed to swap out the original parts for. The axe parts are primarily there for crowd control. The two most basic skills in the axe parts move enemies to the back and front of the crowd respectively, both useful for different reasons. We're also here to show off some of Mag's new parts, the spinner parts, where he uses a yo-yo to attack enemies, and it's rather weird the moveset on that thing. On the one hand, the loop-the-loop skill is useful for hitting awkward enemy formations, but most of the spinner skills seem to be focused on hitting very few enemies. Maybe it'll come into more usefulness later when I figure out a good strategy to go with it. At least with Chain's axe parts, there's a very clear utility at play, a very consistent utility, makes it easy to use. Now onto the dungeon itself, Federico was correct in saying it is randomized, making it more similar to the dungeons from the first game. It's also noteworthy that you can skip the Tower of Despair entirely and not bother with any of these randomized dungeons. You might even not know what you're missing. That seems like a depressingly common theme with this game, is that it's way too easy to miss out on the more interesting game mechanics because they're simply not necessary. Nobody should have to bother with them in a game already this repetitive. And don't get me wrong, the loot we get for going into the Tower of Despair is really cool. But is it worth another 30 to 40 minutes of dungeon crawling through 10 floors of dungeon to get to it? I guess that's up to you. Speaking of dungeon crawling, if you have Chain in your party and use her to navigate the dungeon, you can hold down the A button to go a lot faster, which speeds up the dungeon crawling immensely. If you're not using an emulator, this is the best way to traverse dungeons. And before we head to the 10th floor, it's important to note that we only can go to the 10th floor this time, but as we go further in the game, more floors will unlock and we can get more loot. So we're going to be revisiting the Tower of Despair a couple of times. Whether they're worth their own videos, I'll have to decide later, because most of the time we just come here to get the goodie at the end. Alright, we're back outside. We returned from that adventure that only took you about 2 minutes, but took me 40 or so. We didn't leave empty-handed though. We came back with the Megaphone parts, which are Psyframe parts for Mag, which give him entirely new skills to use. So we're gonna go ahead and equip him with those Megaphone parts, and you'll see what they do shortly. Not in this video, but shortly enough. And now let me go show you what those appraisal items we pick up in the dungeon are for.
Hi there. Something I can do for you today?
And now that we have sufficient funds, we're finally here at the Psyframe Upgrade Shop. At the Psyframe Upgrade Shop, we can upgrade the Psyframe parts we already have, like this. Upgrading Psyframe parts, of course, increases their parameters and makes them more formidable in combat. Since we upgraded the Megaphone parts twice, they will be quite the big deal when we eventually use them, or at least in theory they will.
Come on back when you want a little upgrade.
It's also possible to add more slots to our Psyframe so that way we can use even more parts. But we need an upgrade kit for that, which we don't have right now. So that was the Tower of Despair and our first look at switching Psyframe parts, as well as our first look at upgrading the Psyframe parts. Right now we're going to grab all these healing items we dropped off in preparation for our next adventure, a much bigger adventure that will end in a boss battle. I hope you enjoyed this brisk, hopefully concise coverage of a few mechanics that we hadn't seen before.
I'll pass. Maybe later.